Because interaction is voluntary in a libertarian society, people can only cater to their own self-interest by paying attention to what others want. In a libertarian society, you can't put your competitors out of business through regulations and licensing laws, so you have to serve the customer best. My favorite quote from this book by Dr. Mary J. Ruwart, Short Answers to Tough Questions. We're also going to discuss this new book, Death by Regulation, how we were robbed of a golden age of health and how we can reclaim it. Also, the terrific book, Healing Our World. If you get the new edition, you get summaries at the end of every chapter. Today, Miss Ruwart is with us. Dr. Ruwart, thank you so much for giving me your time.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Sure. So what is libertarianism and why is it compassionate?
Well, libertarianism is really the kind of interaction that we do when we interact with our neighbors one-to-one. We decide that neither of us, if we were neighbors, we wouldn't steal from each other. We wouldn't beat each other up. We wouldn't defraud each other. We'd keep our promises. And if perchance we did one of these things by mistake, like if I put a baseball through your window, for example, you'd expect me to make it good, to fix your window. And we find that to be a very wonderful way to live. And places, neighborhoods that practice that generally are safe, prosperous. Neighborhoods that don't practice that, on the other hand, tend to be dangerous, and they tend not to be very well off financially, because that practice of what I call the non-aggression principle or the good neighbor policy is really what keeps us safe and prosperous. But when we interact group to group, we forget all about that. And that's where political liberty comes in, because when we interact group to group, it's very different. For example, as an individual, if I came to you and said, hey, would you contribute to my favorite charity? You might say no, and I might smile and say, okay, well, maybe next time. But when we interact through government, I'm not satisfied with your answer. I go to the polls and I vote to have a tax imposed on you, so you will contribute to my favorite charity, whether you want to or not. And that gets us into all kinds of trouble. And that's why political liberty, which is basically freedom from this aggression, especially aggression through government, is really so important. And unfortunately, in this country, we at one time had a fair amount of that, and we're kind of going in the other direction because we don't understand this.
So libertarians talk a lot about government. What makes government a unique institution in society and differentiates it from any other group of people?
Well, government can do things legally that you and I cannot do. For example, if I came to your house asking for this contribution to my favorite charity, and you said no, and I pulled a gun on you and said, oh, yes, you will contribute to my favorite charity, hand it over. Well, that would be illegal. I could go to jail. But, the government can do that. And it does that. We call it taxation, and we don't always see the aggression behind that. We don't see how we're violating our neighbor that way. And so we end up having a less prosperous society, and it polarizes us. There's fighting group to group. So it's a prescription for eternal war, both inside the country and outside.
It is really a prescription for war. Like if you didn't have separation of church and state and government made Catholicism legal, we'd all be warring over what religion is best. Because if I don't get hold of it and enforce Mormonism, well, then I'm screwed. Then I have to be a Buddhist or something like that.
Well, that's right. And, we get that with religion. At least our founders did. So they made separation of church and state part of our, Constitution. But we really need that separation in a lot of other areas. We don't have it. And we're actually, even to some extent, losing that in the separation between church and state.
Oh, separation of economy and state, society and state, that'll be the day. So let's say I'm someone who only really cares about the poor. That's why I get involved in politics. If I only care about poverty, solving poverty, whether it be in Atlanta or Bangladesh, why should I care or advocate libertarianism?
Well, the reason you should do that is because government today is the primary source of poverty. And when I say that, of course, people go, what? No, government helps the poor. But there's a lot of hidden things that go behind the scenes, and things like regulations, which keep the poor from getting either that first job or moving ahead. And, John Stossel was really good at demonstrating this. He actually tried to get licenses to have a Frisbee business in Hong Kong, New York, and India. In Hong Kong, it took him a few hours and a few dollars. In New York, it took much more money and weeks. But in India, it was going to take 5 years. And there was no promise that at the end of the 5 years, he'd actually get the licenses. And, the poor people in India, they can't wait 5 years to start creating wealth for themselves and their families. They can't wait that long. And so much of the developing world and the work that's done there and the wealth that's created is done in the black market. And of course, when you're in the black market, you have to pay bribes to the police so they don't shut you down, things like this. So, it's very hard on the poor. And that's why people came to America in its early days, because, in Europe, you had to belong to a guild to practice certain types of professions. And if you didn't know someone or weren't willing to pay a lot of money, you couldn't practice your chosen professions. So they came here because we had few regulations. Now, however, we have made more and more regulations, and so we're seeing more and more poverty. Of course, the poverty we have here is relative to India's is not as big a deal, but still, people can't get ahead if they can't work. And the Libertarian Institute for Justice has been going to court on behalf of these people and really showing the courts that these laws are just creating poverty and they shouldn't be. And they're winning. So I really appreciate what they do. Their website is ij.org for those who are interested in learning more.
All right. Yeah, the government stopping people from getting their foot in the door is such a nuisance. That's something I just keep coming across everywhere I look. So say that I'm someone who really just cares about the environment, and I see freedom as a way for people to pollute without having to face repercussions. If there's no repercussions, they're just going to pollute and they're going to hurt the environment. If I care about the environment, why should I like libertarianism?
Well, if you and I were neighbors and I threw garbage on your lawn, you'd expect me to clean it up. And that's what we should be doing with polluters in this country. If somebody pollutes the river or sends things into the air, they should have to make it right again, which is so expensive that it would be a huge deterrent. But that's not what happens today. The government gives them a little fine. And in many cases, it's more economical for them to pay the fine and pollute. And actually, that shouldn't be surprising, because the greatest polluter of all is the government, the US government, the US military specifically. And most people aren't aware of that, even if they're in the environmental movement. And that's because the government has sovereign immunity. There were several cases in Utah where the government was sued because it had done the nuclear testing in World War II in a way that wasn't very safe, and all these people were getting cancer, and the courts agreed. Oh yes, the cancer came from you being exposed to this radiation, but the government claimed sovereign immunity, so the victims got nothing. And if the government isn't willing to clean up its mess, it's not going to be a very good protector of the environment. So that's really what it's about. And unfortunately, the government has extended its sovereign immunity to some degree to corporations. Corporations are businesses that are allowed to pollute or hurt other people. And when I say allowed, I mean they are allowed, they can only pay restitution to the extent of their corporate assets. Now, it used to be, back before we had corporations, owners had to make good any damage they did to their victims. But today, the stockholders, of course, don't have that responsibility. So they don't keep track of what management's doing oftentimes. And if management pollutes, well, it's the corporate assets that go down, and maybe the stockholders lose a little, money on their stock. But it's usually not enough for them to, except for the biggest stockholders, to really kind of watch things.
So let's say I look out and see that police and investigators are the way that crime is deterred, crime being force or fraud.
Mhm.
If I care about deterring crime, I don't want my car stolen, I don't want my house invaded, I don't want someone taking my phone and going through and finding all the things about me. If I care about deterring crime, why should I advocate libertarianism?
Well, today our police have basically a kind of a monopoly or quasi monopoly on protecting you. But courts have ruled that they really don't have to come out and help you as an individual if there's a problem. And so they usually show up after the fact, which doesn't help you because you want to prevent this. Private police, on the other hand, in cities where the towns have decided it's just too expensive to hire, municipal police, have found that their crime drops precipitously because it makes economic sense for the private police to prevent crime before it starts. So what they do is they make it a point to train citizens and how to keep their doors locked, which locks to use, security systems, and the private police will even check on your house, while you're away, say on vacation or something, so that and everybody knows that, of course, in the area. So the criminals decide that they'll go elsewhere.
Yeah, you can definitely see things like alarm systems or just security locks, or like my bank texts me all the time, interesting activity on your account. Those are all private voluntary mechanisms to try and deter crime, which you don't
Yes.
see a lot of innovation coming out of the state. If they keep you safe, you have to pay them. If they don't keep you safe, well, you still have to pay them. In fact, their budgets tend to increase whenever they don't keep you safe, like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or something. Um, okay, moving on to further crime. What about foreign crime? So, how would a libertarian society diffuse terrorism, as you put it in the title of this
Yes.
book, Healing Our World?
Well, unfortunately, we do a lot of things that encourage other countries to hate us and attack us. Now, let's, for example, take Japan and 9/11. Those are the two times when our country was actually attacked in its own sphere, so to speak. And one of the reasons Japan was so upset with us was because we gave aid to its enemy, China. We had our naval ships going into their territorial waters. And of course, that isn't supposed to happen without their permission. And we also had an embargo on oil to Japan. So those were things that really irritated them. And, when 9/11 happened and Osama bin Laden told the reasons for the attack, he said almost the very same things. He talked about the embargo on Iraq. He talked about the military bases that were established in Iraqi, and I'm not Iraqi, but the Middle East territories. Some of them were sacred sites. And he also mentioned that we were giving aid to Israel, Islam's enemy. So you can see there are certain things that we do with our tax dollars that encourage attack. And so one of the big things we could do is not do those things. The other thing we can do is trade. Now, you might have noticed that after World War II, Japan became our trading partner. In fact, so much so, we couldn't even imagine attacking Japan or having them attack us. It would destroy both of our economies. So it's really interesting. You don't generally attack your trading partners. So instead of embargoes, we should be trading. So there's these things we can do. Obviously, nothing's perfect, but had we not done those things, we probably wouldn't have gone to war. In fact, there have been government documents that have been uncovered in the mid-90s, which showed that the president actually decided to do these three things that I talked about to Japan, and invade their territorial waters and help their enemy. And these things were done deliberately to encourage Japan to attack because our president wanted to enter World War II.
Yeah, it's funny. I've heard that theory, and I had to look into it. It turns out the document is called the Mccullen Memo, and it's from this book, Day of
Yes.
Deceit. by Robert Stinnett. And it actually is a document by Arthur Mccullen. And he goes, here are the 8 things we could do to get Japan to strike first.
Mm-hmm.
You also have Secretary of War Henry Stimson writing in his diary saying, the plan of today's meeting was how to get Japan to make the first overt move. As far as 9/11, you can look up Osama bin Laden, 8-page letter to the Americans. He talks about the Iraqi sanctions after the first Gulf War, which killed heaven knows how many, but for that you can look up Leslie Stahl, Madeleine Albright, 60 Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a recent popular video on YouTube, an anti-freedom video, said this new machine replaces 17 workers in the manufacturing sector. This goes to show you that freedom just doesn't work because people are replaced with machines, people get out of work, poverty increases. So free trade, freedom, capitalism, investment actually makes us poorer. What is the libertarian response to capitalism destroys jobs and eventually impoverishes the masses?
Well, capitalism really is the greatest engine of wealth creation, especially for the poor. And you can see this because let's take the example you gave. So the people that are put out of work because we have this phone or whatever that does 17 things, remember there's a bunch of other jobs at a much higher level and much higher pay that have to come about to make that phone. So the beauty of that is where we have technology, we end up upgrading our workforce. We have to in order to produce these things. And so what ends up happening is our workforce becomes more well-paid, not more poorly paid. Another thing that's interesting is the products themselves, as they're out longer, get cheaper and cheaper. If you go to any developing country today, you'll see many people have phones. They may not have computers, but they have phones, and they get the internet and they do all their business on the phone, and it's really a wonderful thing. So even in the developing countries, there are a lot of this technology is enabling the people who are not so well off to become better off. And you know, I always laughed because the World Bank used to say, oh, well, I don't know if these countries in the developing world getting richer are helping the poor. And then a few years later they did a total reverse and said, okay, we've done the studies and look, the poor are better off. So even even a group that really was against technology and development and prosperity in a country and thought that the rich got richer found out that it's the poor who get richer.
Yes, I think it was in like 1750, America had 80% of the workforce in agriculture, and now it's 2%. So the anti-freedom mentality will go, all right, so 78% unemployment. That's what must be existing in 2018. And the more free trade, the fewer jobs. Oh, there must be like 10 people employed in America. And of course, it's just the opposite. Like Marx was wrong about everything. Okay. Another objection: freedom creates monopolies. In other words, with unregulated industry, you have one group who just buys up their competitors, gets a monopoly on potential consumers. Once they have that, they can jack up the price. Therefore, government regulation is justified. How do you respond?
Well, actually, it's the government that's the creator of monopolies. And it's really a really good example is the AT&T monopoly. You know, the government said, well, okay, communications is a natural monopoly. So we'll let AT&T lobby all the local areas and they can pick one provider. And of course, most of them picked AT&T because it was big because it had patents for so long. This is when its patents were running out. It had to find another way to keep its monopoly. So for many years it did. And what AT&T did, because it had a monopoly, is it could charge whatever it wanted. In theory, it was regulated, but the way it was regulated is that it could get a certain percent of profit. So it did research and development, all kinds of different areas, and deducted all that so that it would make the established profit, but it's already getting into other areas where it's going to make more. Well, as soon as and the reason AT&T did that is because when its patents ran out, what it found is that about 50% of their customers went to these smaller companies that only had local service, but that's what they wanted, So that's why it did all this lobbying to get this monopoly. Well, I remember back, at the time when AT&T had a monopoly. I'm dating myself, sorry. When AT&T had a monopoly on long distance, and the bills were horrific. When MCI came in and sued and said, that's a monopoly, we shouldn't have it. And so even though it was a government, the laws had been encouraging that monopoly, not stopping it. So AT&T won that suit, and overnight the long distance rates dropped by 50%. That's huge. And and AT&T was able to keep the local service, but it's been so bad about charging a lot for local service that most people use their cell phones today and don't have a landline. So that's a good example. And the Rockefeller example, which is the one that's usually used, Standard Oil had a near monopoly for about 3 years, and then its smaller competitors came along and started underselling it. Every time Rockefeller tried to raise prices of oil, the competitors would come in and take his customers away. So he had to keep the prices low. By the time the antitrust suit happened in 1911, I think it already lost somewhere, had already lost 40 to 50% of their refining monopoly. So it was sort of redundant. In other words, monopolies are creatures of government, not of capitalism generally.
Yeah, it's amazing. People are like, oh, I'm so terrified about there being a monopoly in one sector, but the government should have a monopoly on AR-15s and bump stocks and taxation and regulation and lawmaking. Oh, come on. Just pick one, for heaven's sake. Another criticism that comes up is businesses need regulation or consumer protection. In other words, the example Ralph Nader gives is, I'm at a restaurant and I'm just looking at the food. I have no way of deterring just with my eyes or feeling if it has salmonella, if it's going to poison me in some other way, if it's unhealthy. Therefore, OSHA is justified in regulating these industries just to make sure that products and services are safe for the populace at large to who they're selling. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's bad business to kill off your customers, obviously. So, companies rarely do that. And when they do it, it's usually a mistake on their part. You still hear cases of salmonella in a restaurant and things like this because the inspectors can't inspect every moment of time. A better way to do it, in my opinion, is to have certifications. And actually, some restaurants do that sort of indirectly today. Certifiers, would be like a private group of people who really had, how can I say it? More efficient standards of how a restaurant should operate. Unfortunately, if you've dealt with regulators, as I have for apartments, for example, they regulate kind of by the rule book. So like I had situations in low-income housing where I had to tear out a kitchen counter because it was 2 inches too short and put in a new one, which meant, of course, that my tenants had to have their rents raised a little bit to pay for that. So that happens in the food industry as well. And so certifiers tend to focus on things that will really make you safe. And then if the restaurants do, and these institutions, these certifiers have a lot of incentive to come often, where often the regulators don't come very often. They just come when there's a complaint. It's because if the certifier puts their seal of approval on that restaurant, the restaurant makes people sick, then no one's going to want to come to that certifier or trust their mark anymore, and they'll be out of business. So it's a much better way to do it, is to have multiple certifiers.
Oh, yeah. And just the principle of voluntarily funded competing certifiers is just better than coercively funded monopoly regulator.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't really see how you make that monopoly argument. They need a monopoly on regulation. Speaking of further regulation, you wrote this book, Death by Regulation. This has got to be the best title I think I've ever heard. So say that I look out and see that American healthcare is so expensive. I hear stories of people paying $20 for a Tylenol tablet. I hear hospital stays costing $100,000, and keeping a child in, say, an incubator is up to $1 million if it's a number of months. Why is healthcare so expensive, and why do libertarians have the solution?
Okay, so having been in the pharmaceutical industry for 19 years, I'm very familiar with those regulations, and I can, and basically I make the case in Death by Regulation that 80% of them really don't improve safety or effectiveness at all, but they drive the price up. And the price has been driven up about sevenfold since the 1962 amendments were passed. So we are paying a huge overhead on regulations that don't protect us. And the reason I say they don't protect us is because the withdrawal rate of drugs that the FDA approved from the market, in other words, they're approved by the FDA. When they're out there, we find there's side effects, we take them off the market. That percentage was about 2.5% before the 1962 amendments. Now it's up to about 3.3%. Those numbers might not be different, what we call significantly different in the scientific jargon, but they didn't go in the direction they were supposed to go, right? Drugs aren't more safe. In fact, there's a lot of reasons that drugs are less safe today because the price has been driven up so high. And when I say the price, I mean the price of getting FDA approval and then the price that we have to pay at the pharmacy because of the higher cost of development, right? So it's affecting us both. But what that does is it means that companies can no longer really develop a compound that you take once or maybe for a week or two easily. They have to develop something that you're going to take for a lifetime. And when you start taking drugs for a lifetime, there are more chances of side effects. Your body's very good when you take drugs for a short period of time, but not so good when you take them for a long period of time. It also discourages developing natural products, which our body is used to seeing. It can take care of those. And it does that because you have to go through a 10 to 14 year development process. It used to be 4 years before the amendments. So if you have to go through 10 to 14 years of development, you really need a patent or you can't possibly recover those costs. So like before, when I first started in the industry, we developed some drugs without patents. This was in the mid 70s. But then by the late 70s, the company managers said, no, we're not going to develop any more compounds without a patent because these 1962 amendments made things so expensive. And people die waiting. The AIDS patients actually went to the black market, hired chemists to make the very drugs we were working on in the drug companies. And by the time FDA gave us permission finally to test them in people, every AIDS patient in the country that wanted them had already had them. And they were resistant. So we had to wait for new people to be diagnosed before we could run our tests. And this is happening today as well. We have ALS patients making drugs in their kitchen that are currently under development, hoping that drug will save them. And it's very sad. It's very sad. So I estimated that probably each of us have lost 5 to 10 years of our lives because of these regulations, which keep drugs and nutrients from us for long periods of time.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was waiting for the pro-choice, your body is your choice, people to really support us when it came to going around the FDA or right to try. And I heard crickets from them. But very unfortunate that wasn't created.
There is a group. The people who take vitamins and minerals and are very conscious of their health are well aware that the FDA is keeping them from things that they want. And the reason is that if a company today wants to develop a natural product and it puts its intention into the FDA can outlaw that nutrient and take it off the market. And this is something that's being fought in the natural product community right now. Because this is starting to affect some things that people really want to be able to take over the counter.
So you mentioned the 1962 new FDA regulations. A common argument is you look at prior to 1962, and what resulted was you had a drug called thalidomide, in which pictures were shown of deformed babies because mothers had taken this medicine because we did not have a strong federal drug administration. How do you respond to thalidomide sort of injustices are a justification for an interventionist FDA, or at least the existence of an FDA?
Sure. Well, the FDA actually had enough power before 1962 to stop unsafe drugs from coming into the country. And one of the FDA examiners was concerned about another side effect of thalidomide, a neuropathy type side effect, the nerve damage. And so she said, no, until I see more safety data, we won't approve this drug. FDA had, it didn't need the 62 amendments. It already had the authority to stop an unsafe drug. But of course, back then, and I saw those pictures, as a child. I was about 11 or 12 when that happened. So when I saw those pictures, of course, I was very distressed, as were my parents. But the problem was that back in those days, it wasn't widely appreciated that the fetus is so much more sensitive than the mother to drugs. So when thalidomide was first marketed, it was marketed as a safer sleeping drug than barbiturates, and it was very hard to overdose and die from it. But the problem is the manufacturers didn't realize that it could be a problem in pregnancy. Now, because of the thalidomide incident, so, you were looking at a problem with our knowledge base, our scientific knowledge. But now, of course, we test drugs in animals that are pregnant. That's no guarantee, because about 50% of the side effects that you see in animals don't happen in humans, and vice versa. So, bottom line is, whenever you're offered a drug to take by your doctor, you and your doctor should discuss the risks and benefits, because you never know. There might be another side effect that you're not aware of.
Another unsung monopoly in society is one group gets the right to engage in compulsory education, and you have to fund it as well. So if attending it isn't bad enough, I'm curious, what is the libertarian position on, in order to have a functioning society, the people who occupy that society need at least some level of education or schooling? How do you respond to education's a necessity? Some people can't afford it, therefore state action and involvement is justified.
Well, before we had compulsory and public schooling, we were considered the most literate nation on earth. You couldn't even go to school until you knew how to read. So children learned how to read at home, and then the schooling was very intense by today's standards. I have I think it's an 8th or 9th grade math book where the students are expected to calculate the percent of interest, not the percent of interest, but the actual dollar interest on their mortgages. I don't think many college grads could do that today. So, the schooling was actually quite good. The problem with having a one-size-fits-all education, which is what we have more or less today, I mean, there are some exceptions, is that you don't address people individually. And there's been a lot of methodology out there that shows that it's very easy to make that happen. In other words, the way it happens in a family is the older children teach the younger children, right? Well, in some of the schools and the systems that were worked out, that's exactly what happened in the actual schools. And, you learn by teaching it to a large degree. So it reinforced for the older children what they already knew, and maybe took them to a higher level, if you will. So, these systems are out there. They're very inexpensive. And, today with the internet, you can go online and you can get a world-class education, for the price of having an internet connection. So, education doesn't have to be this expensive thing that happens in buildings. And the other problem is, of course, who decides what's taught? And so you've been talking and asking me questions about what I'd say are common economic fallacies that are promoted by our schools today. And so it's really no wonder, that people don't understand these things.
So, when communicating the message of the compassion of libertarianism, do you, or I guess this would also apply to food and drug regulations, do you prefer to make the principled case? In other words, if I want to drink Windex, I have the right to, or do you try to argue from the consequentialist costs and benefits point of view?
It depends who I'm talking to. Now, I know many of your listeners are probably libertarians, and they already know the moral arguments. What they might not know are the practical arguments. And those are important too, because the moral and the practical are two sides of the same coin. And you need to know both sides, or what'll happen is people won't see how it will work. In fact, I find that many libertarians, even for a particular issue, might not see how it works. And when they do, when they can't see that, then they tend to doubt that freedom is always the way. And because they doubt that, they can't communicate properly. And so one of the things that I recommend is that, people really get intensely educated, not just on the moral, but on the practical. Because if it doesn't work in the real world, would any of us support libertarianism if it made us poorer, made the world more polluted, encouraged war? I don't think so.
Sure, and it's always the pile of bodies that statism has created telling us, oh, your system might lead to bad things. Totally ridiculous. Speaking of bad things, here is an argument often made that without regulations in the banking sector, banking is unique because it controls the medium of exchange that everyone has to use to survive. State regulation is justified because in the absence of banking regulations, you have the stock market crash of 1929, you have the financial savings and loans crisis of the 80s, and the '08 collapse. How do you respond to someone who is so terrified of the Goldman Sachs and the JP Morgans of the world that they justify things like Dodd-Frank and Glass-Steagall and other regulatory burdens on the financial sector?
Well, the reason that, banks got big, if you will, instead of staying local, is because a lot of the regulations forced that change. For example, in the 1800s in our country, state banks had reserves, the various local banks had reserves, but the regulations said that part of those reserves had to be in government debt. So when somebody came to get their cash, there wasn't much cash in the reserves, and, people wouldn't accept the government debt. So, that really gave us a lot of problems. And then the Federal Reserve was established in the early 1900s, and it caused massive inflation. And that actually was accelerated when we went off the gold standard in the 1930s. So once inflation started, we had a lot of these problems. Also, what happens is today, if the banks look like they're going bankrupt, we bail them out. Now, something very different happened in the era of free banking. And in my book, I talk about Scotland as a good example of this. In the mid 1800s, things were different. There were competing banks and competing currencies, and there was a central exchange, where the banks traded each other's currencies. But if they saw a bank was inflating their currency, the other banks wouldn't accept their currency at face value. And so there was this break on inflation. And also, if a bank went bankrupt, its owners were liable. So they had to, restitution. We talked about this earlier in the program. So they needed to pay out, to the depositors. And if they went bankrupt, then the other banks often would take customers and basically reimburse their deposits for them. Why? Because they got a loyal customer, for one thing. And for another thing, it kept people's faith in the banking system. Because, if you think the bank's going to go bankrupt, or any bank is going to go bankrupt, you're hesitant to use the banking system, especially back then. So bottom line, if you look at the era of free banking, and I have about 8 different examples, and then you look at similar periods in other countries that didn't have free banking, what you see is that were fewer bankruptcies, fewer runs on the bank, fewer problems with free banking. And that's because the responsibility was with the people who inflated the currency. Now, today, we have government inflating the currency by, the way it deficit spends. It basically borrows money from the Federal Reserve, and I'm making this very simplified here. So those of you who know all the details of how this transaction happens realize that I'm abbreviating it. So they borrow from the Federal Reserve. So if you look at our Federal Reserve notes, basically they're a debt that our children are going to have to make good at some point in time. And there's only two ways to do it. One is to basically give up all we have as payment, or create so much wealth that we can pay it off. I, of course, favor creating more wealth, and that's what a libertarian society can do.
The Federal Reserve, that's another.
Say again?
I was going to say Federal Reserve is another example of a monopoly that the average status is totally okay with, but terrified of the candle monopoly that existed in like the 1800s.
That's right.
What is the biggest economic fallacy?
I think it's really expressed well in the slogan, "I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you." Because even though, even though as libertarians, one of us probably made that up. I don't know who. It's a great slogan. But, even though people have seen this, I think they do believe that the government is there to help them. And they want to believe that because, we all want to believe there's something out there protecting us, right? But the problem is, if the government abuses us, we are slow to see it. Just as if we were a child, we'd be slow to say that our parents were abusing us. Even if they were, we'd want to stay with them. I mean, there's a natural tendency, I think, to not to admit that the government's abusing us, because that's much scarier than thinking it's there to protect us.
What is the libertarian answer to gun control? A popular meme going around was, if mental health is the problem, why aren't the mentally unhealthy people in Australia and Britain going on great shootings?
Well, obviously, I'm sorry, that's always a biggie. I always think that someone who believes in gun control should show their belief by putting a sign in their yard saying, this house is a gun-free zone. I've never seen those signs. And the reason I've never seen them, I believe, is I think there's a visceral knowledge that if you advertise that you can't defend yourself, that you're going to be victimized. And that's basically, of course, what guns are for. They're not to aggress against others. They're to protect yourself. And that's especially true for women or the disabled or the elderly. Because, if somebody comes in, chances are it's going to be somebody bigger, stronger, or quicker. And having that protection, gives you, first of all, might give peace of mind, but it also gives the possibility not of shooting someone if they're coming in your house, but just letting them know you have a gun is enough to start them running usually. And there's been surveys done of criminals. They avoid areas where there's guns. And there's been a lot of studies on what has happened when concealed carry permits have been started to be issued in a state. Crime goes down, rapes go down, violent crime, it's much less. So I would say to somebody who wants gun control to go ahead and put that sign in their yard and see what happens.
Yeah. Also, you have all the crimes that governments have committed with guns. So just giving the guns to the most violent people doesn't actually deter violence.
That's right. I mean, we could talk about any of these questions for hours. I'm trying to be brief so that we can handle a lot of them.
Sure. So say that I look at roads as something that I only know of governments creating, of something that if I don't have access to and it's private and I'm excluded, I'm basically finished. I can't go to the store. I can't go to school. I can't see my friends. How would the road problem and that sort of being a public good, how is that addressed in a libertarian society?
It'd probably be addressed the very same way it was addressed out west when we, didn't have a formal government, because for many, many years, the settled territories were not states. They weren't formally affiliated, so they didn't have government roads. They made their own. And, you can make them at various levels. Today, obviously, there'd be interstates, there'd be local roads, and they might be handled differently. We have interstates in my area, and I have a little sticker in my car. So when I go through the toll booth, I don't actually go through a booth at all. There's some lights flashing up above me as I drive by at 60 or 70 miles an hour that notes that I'm going there. Excuse me for a minute. Let me take a quick drink. So, there might be some tolls, but, like a community road, for example, in a condo type community, you pay a fee for upkeep. Now, I live in a community where some of the roads here are taken care of by the state or the county, but other ones, are private roads. And we, our community has dues so that we take care of those 6 roads that are ours, so there's different ways to do it. And of course, we don't exclude anybody. Although I have to say in St. Louis, some communities got tired of having what they considered a lot of questionable individuals, riffraff. They were afraid maybe because they were in a bad part of town. They actually bought the roads and had the street would be owned by the residents, and the residents decided to close it at certain times so that they could, be aware of who was coming in because they were having, criminal activity. So, those kinds of things, there's all different ways to handle it. But the thing to remember about the roads is people were building way before the government was, and they would again if they were able to keep their tax dollars in their pocket and do it. Because when the government builds roads, it's one of the most inefficient things they do. It's at least 50% less expensive to have it private, and sometimes it's as much as 10% of the cost. So that's a big savings.
So the radio host Sam Cedar is just terrified of someone's bike being stolen in a libertarian society. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He goes, well, how do you know it's their bike? Who's going to do it? What if there's a shootout? In fact, he's so terrified, he justifies a genocidal government at pretty much any level. I'm curious, how would a restitution be dealt with in a libertarian society?
Well, of course, there's many forms that it could take. Let me give you a real life example, because I always like real life examples. In Japan, if I stole from you, I stole your bicycle, and of course I was caught, I would probably send a representative, my attorney or my family members. They'd come to you and they'd say, Keith, what's it going to take to make this right again for you? And you might say, my bike returned in good condition. I missed a day of work because I didn't have my bike to ride there, whatever it was. And we'd come to some settlement. And then in Japan, we'd go to court. And you would say, oh, judge, yeah, Mary did steal my bicycle, but I'm happy with the settlement. So, go easy on her. So I might get a day or two in jail. Whereas if we didn't come to terms and the judge decided it was my fault because I was negotiating in good faith, I could get a much bigger sentence. Now, in a libertarian society, you see, I think there'd be a model something like that, except the aggressor would also have to pay the court costs, for the judge, for example. And if I was imprisoned because I wasn't willing to make a settlement, I'd have to pay for my own imprisonment too. So I have a lot of incentive, to stay out of prison and make sure I make my payments to you. And there's a lot of people who think that people steal because they just can't work, but that's not the case. In fact, I think it's my great-great-great-grandfather had a saddle factory, and he employed, in the St. Louis area, he employed prisoners to work in it, and it was quite successful. And the prisoners all could do a pretty good job, and they paid for the room and board that way and by, having gardens and things like this. So, you know, it's very possible. In fact, today it's really possible because there was a group in New England, a prison in New England, that allowed their prisoners to make crafts. This was about 20 years ago. And some of these people were making so much money, and they were making 30, 40, 50 grand a year. And the local crafts people were complaining because, of course, the prisoners were making these things and selling them at a cheap price, so they outlawed that practice. But you know, you can see it's very possible. And in Healing Our World, I kind of go through a lot of these different descriptions. And I should mention to your listeners that if they, I mean, obviously I would love for them to buy the most recent edition, but if they want to read the 93 edition, it's free on my website at ruwart.com in my free library. So they might enjoy it.
See, I knew we could get education without the state. There you go. just download the PDF. Say I am a minority in a country, and I fear that without some state requirements, I might be discriminated against because of my sex, my gender, my ethnicity, my nationality. Why is discrimination justified, or how would it be dealt with in a libertarian society?
Mm-hmm. Well, the important thing is getting your foot in the door. You know, I was in a profession, the sciences, back in a time when I was often the only woman in the science class. So I was very aware of discrimination, but there was a good reason for it in many ways, because a lot of the women who wanted a research job, basically their main goal was to get married and have children. And so they were out of the workforce after the company invested a lot of money. And so what I did is I decided there were two ways in which I could promote myself to prospective employers. One, I would outperform the men. Two, I would let them know that it wasn't my intent to have children, so that they would know, even when the law became such that they couldn't ask me, I could certainly tell them. So I did that. And so this is what happens. And for example, one of the things that interferes with this process is things like the minimum wage. When I started in college, I was able to get paid for working in the lab, and it was way under the minimum wage, but I didn't care. I would have worked for free for the experience, you know. Halfway through my education, minimum wage kicked in on those jobs too. So now I could no longer work except for minimum wage, and the laborers couldn't afford me. So what I had to do was I had to pay Michigan State for credit, and so I could do an independent study. So I had to pay to play, so to speak, instead of being paid to play. And this is how minimum wage keeps people from getting training. In fact, if you look at a graph as minimum wage goes up and is covering more jobs, the Black teenage unemployment goes down. And that's because obviously they're discriminated against, and now they can't underbid their competitors. They can't work harder than their competitors, you know, the white teenagers. So is it good that they were discriminated against? No, but the solution for discrimination is exposure. And so, you know, if you hire somebody, you know, that's of a race you might not be so comfortable with, but you do so because they're willing to work hard or be paid less, then eventually you go, whoa, wait a minute. I don't want to lose this person to the guy down the street who's going to pay him more. He's too valuable, so I'm going to give him a raise. And that's how it works. So, and the other thing is adoption. The state actually used to forbid, for example, Black babies to be adopted by white couples. So the white couples were going to China for their babies. Well, the Institute for Justice that we talked about earlier actually sued here in Texas and won the case that discrimination shouldn't be happening. And so what was wonderful is that ruling was applied throughout the country. And now, of course, that restriction is no longer in place. The Romans knew when they conquered countries that if they married the wives and adopted the children, they would have a peaceful country. And that's what they did. And that's what we should be doing too.
What is one book that you haven't written that you would recommend for everyone to read?
Oh, that's a good question. And it's a toughie too, because there's so many good books out there. let's see. That's a toughie. I would have difficulty, but I think I did read one recently that I think would help libertarians understand why their arguments often fall on deaf ears. And that's a book called The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt, and I'm going to spell his name, Haidt. And I'm spelling it because I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. It really explains how people come to morality. And it's usually, to give you a very brief thing, you know, we have a gut reaction to things. And then our reason usually justifies our gut reaction to some extent. And of course, when you understand this, and he goes through, it's quite a fascinating book. He goes through a lot of things, and you come to understand the way in which one needs to approach talking to people about this.
All right, so I just want to close by plugging Healing Our World. Now look at this. You actually get drawings in this new edition along with summaries that allow you to really make sense of what's going on. This is probably my favorite drawing in the entire book. So definitely check that out. Also, death by regulation. Every time freedom ends in something going bad, it's all over the media. But whenever people are forcibly stopped from innovation and innovative activities, it's a little harder to unearth. This book will definitely do that for you. Miss Ruwart, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you, Keith, for doing this. It's great.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye-bye.